The subpoenas were served at 6:47 a.m. Central Time on January 21st. 5 manila envelopes delivered simultaneously to 5 different addresses across Minnesota. Governor Tim Walz received his at the governor's residence. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey at City Hall, St. Paul Mayor Kaoli Herr at her private home, State Attorney General Keith Ellison at his office downtown, Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty at the courthouse. The timing wasn't coincidental. Federal prosecutors wanted maximum psychological impact, and they got it. By 8 a.m., the political class understood what was happening. This wasn't about immigration enforcement or local resistance to federal authority. This was about the systematic destruction of federalism itself. The Justice Department was weaponizing criminal law to eliminate opposition to presidential power. The constitutional framework that had governed America since 1787 was being replaced by something that looked increasingly like autocracy. The immediate market response was panic selling of anything connected to American institutional stability. The dollar fell 2.1% against major currencies in overnight trading. Treasury yields spiked as international investors demanded higher premiums for American political risk. But the most dramatic movement was in silver, which opened $12 higher in Asian markets and continued climbing throughout the European session. Because this wasn't just about Minnesota, it was about whether America would remain a federal republic or become a unitary state controlled from Washington. The implications extended far beyond politics into the fundamental question of economic relationships. If states couldn't protect their citizens from federal overreach, if local officials could be criminally prosecuted for defending state authority, then the entire structure of American governance was collapsing. The legal theory behind the subpoenas was deliberately vague and maximally threatening. Federal prosecutors claimed that Minnesota officials had conspired to obstruct federal immigration enforcement by failing to provide assistance to ICE operations. The alleged obstruction included refusing to share local law enforcement resources, declining to detain individuals beyond their scheduled release dates, and providing legal counsel to individuals facing deportation proceedings. But the real innovation was treating policy disagreements as criminal conspiracies. Every decision by state and local officials to prioritize different values than federal authorities was being reframed as potential criminal conduct. The message was clear: resistance to federal power would be met with prosecutorial force. Democracy was being replaced by prosecution. The timing of the subpoenas revealed the strategic nature of the escalation. They came just days after the Pentagon had positioned troops for potential deployment to Minnesota. The legal and military pressure campaigns were coordinated elements of a comprehensive strategy to break state resistance through any means necessary. Constitutional protections were irrelevant when survival was at stake. Financial markets understood the implications before political commentators did. Hedge funds with exposure to state and municipal bonds began liquidating positions. Credit rating agencies put Minnesota debt on negative watch. Insurance companies suspended coverage for political risk events. The economic infrastructure of federalism was being systematically dismantled. The silver market was experiencing unprecedented demand from sources that had never previously shown interest in precious metals. Pension funds for state employees were quietly diversifying into physical silver as a hedge against federal asset seizures. Municipal governments were establishing commodity reserves in case traditional banking relationships became untenable. Even police and fire departments were converting portions of their budgets to precious metals. The legal implications extended far beyond Minnesota's borders. If federal prosecutors could criminalize state officials for policy disagreements in one state, they could do it anywhere. California's sanctuary policies could be prosecuted as criminal conspiracies. Texas's border enforcement efforts could be treated as federal obstruction. New York's financial regulations could become federal crimes. No state was safe from prosecution. Corporate America was beginning to understand that the rule of law had been replaced by the rule of power. Companies with significant Minnesota operations faced impossible choices: comply with federal demands and alienate state customers, or maintain state relationships and risk federal prosecution. The business environment was becoming untenable for anyone caught between conflicting authorities. The mining industry was particularly vulnerable to these pressures. Minnesota's Iron Range contained significant silver deposits that had become strategically important as global supply chains fragmented. Federal control of the state would mean federal control of mining operations. International markets were already pricing in scenarios where American silver production would be allocated based on political loyalty rather than economic efficiency. Foreign governments were watching the Minnesota developments with obvious concern. If America could prosecute its own state officials for policy disagreements, what did that mean for international relationships? Canadian officials began quietly discussing contingency plans for American political collapse. Mexican authorities accelerated preparations for refugee influxes from American political violence. The The international community was losing confidence in American stability. Central banks worldwide were reassessing their dollar holdings in light of American political fragmentation. The Bank of Japan announced it would monitor developments in American federalism before making future investment decisions. The Swiss National Bank increased its gold and silver allocations, citing geopolitical uncertainty in reserve currency nations. Even allies were hedging against American political collapse. The European Central Bank held emergency sessions to discuss dollar alternatives for international trade. The prospect of American constitutional breakdown created systemic risks that extended far beyond bilateral relationships. If the world's reserve currency was issued by a government that prosecuted its own state officials, the entire international monetary system needed restructuring. China's response was characteristically opportunistic. Beijing announced it would accept silver payments for certain trade transactions, providing an alternative to dollar-denominated commerce. The offer was positioned as a temporary accommodation to international uncertainty, but everyone understood its real purpose. China was accelerating de-dollarization while America was distracted by internal conflict. The cryptocurrency markets experienced massive inflows as traders sought alternatives to traditional financial systems. But even crypto wasn't immune to American political risk. If federal prosecutors could criminalize state officials, they could criminalize anyone. Physical assets like silver became the only store of value that couldn't be confiscated through digital manipulation. Academic economists began modeling scenarios for American economic fragmentation that had seemed impossible just months earlier. If different states operated under different legal frameworks, could they maintain a common currency? If federal and state authorities issued conflicting regulations, which would markets follow? The theoretical questions were becoming practical necessities. The insurance industry was among the first to adapt to the new reality. Lloyd's of London announced it would no longer underwrite political risk coverage for American state and local governments. The risks had become incalculable and uninsurable. Other major insurers followed suit, effectively declaring that American federalism was too unstable to support normal business relationships. Legal scholars were debating whether America was experiencing a constitutional crisis or a constitutional collapse. The distinction mattered because crises could be resolved through existing mechanisms, while collapse required entirely new structures. The prosecutions in Minnesota suggested that existing mechanisms were being systematically destroyed rather than reformed. State legislators across the country began introducing bills to protect local officials from federal prosecution. The proposed laws would make it a state crime to cooperate with federal prosecutions of state officials acting within their authority. The legislation was probably unconstitutional, but constitutional law was rapidly becoming irrelevant when political survival was at stake. The precious metals storage industry was experiencing unprecedented demand from institutional clients seeking to physically segregate assets from federal oversight. Brinks and other security companies were establishing new storage facilities in states with strong constitutional protections. The geographic distribution of wealth was changing as institutional investors sought political safe havens. International law experts were drawing comparisons to failed state transitions in other countries. The pattern was depressingly familiar. Central authorities used legal mechanisms to destroy local autonomy, creating institutional breakdown that leads to economic collapse and social fragmentation. America was following a well-worn path towards systemic failure. The tech industry was particularly vulnerable to federal-state legal conflicts. Companies with operations across multiple states couldn't comply with conflicting legal demands. Apple suspended certain operations in Minnesota pending legal clarity. Microsoft announced it would reassess state-level investments until constitutional issues were resolved. The digital economy required legal predictability that no longer existed. Military contractors faced their own version of the crisis. Defense companies with facilities in Minnesota were being asked to support federal operations against the state governments that hosted their operations. Lockheed Martin's Minneapolis facilities employed thousands of local residents who were now potential targets of federal prosecution. The military-industrial complex was discovering that civil conflict created impossible ethical dilemmas. Agricultural markets were experiencing their own disruptions as farmers calculated the risks of operating under conflicting federal and state authorities. Minnesota's grain production was essential to national food security, but farmers couldn't operate profitably under legal uncertainty. Food prices began rising as agricultural supply chains adapted to political fragmentation. The Federal Reserve faced an unprecedented challenge in maintaining monetary policy coherence when political authority itself was fragmenting. How do you manage a currency when different states operate under different legal systems? How do you ensure financial stability when the banking system serves conflicting political masters? The central bank's traditional tools were proving inadequate for political breakdown. International credit markets were beginning to price American political risk into sovereign debt calculations. Treasury auctions were experiencing lower demand and higher yields as investors demanded premiums for political instability. The full faith and credit of the United States government was being questioned by the same global markets that had treated it as risk-free for generations. Corporate law firms were establishing specialized practices in constitutional crisis management as businesses sought guidance for operating under conflicting authorities. The legal advice was uniformly sobering. There were no good options when fundamental political authority was disputed. Companies could only minimize exposure and hope for eventual resolution. The energy sector was particularly exposed to federal-state conflicts because power generation required both federal environmental approvals and state operational permits. If federal and state authorities issued conflicting demands, how would power plants operate? The grid itself could become a casualty of political warfare. Religious institutions were forming mutual aid networks that operated independently of both federal and state authorities. Churches began accepting silver donations and providing services based on commodity exchanges rather than currency transactions. The social safety net was adapting to political breakdown by reverting to pre-monetary economic relationships. Educational institutions faced their own version of the crisis as federal and state funding sources imposed conflicting requirements. Universities with both federal grants and state appropriations couldn't satisfy both masters simultaneously. Higher education was being forced to choose political sides or cease operations. Healthcare systems were discovering that medical ethics and political loyalty were increasingly incompatible. Hospitals that served both federal employees and state residents couldn't provide care to one group while criminalizing the other. The medical profession was fracturing along the same lines as political authority. Labor unions found their members split between federal and state loyalties in ways that threatened organizational coherence. Police unions couldn't represent officers who served both federal and state authorities when those authorities were in criminal conflict. Collective bargaining became impossible when the parties to negotiations owed allegiance to different governments. The media industry was struggling to cover a story that challenged fundamental assumptions about American governance. How do you report on federal prosecutions when federalism itself was collapsing? How do you maintain objectivity when the legal system was being used as a political weapon? Traditional journalism was proving inadequate for constitutional breakdown. Private security companies were experiencing massive growth as individuals and institutions sought protection that didn't require choosing between federal and state authority. But private security couldn't resolve the underlying problem of legal uncertainty. Armed guards might protect property, but they couldn't determine which laws applied or which courts had jurisdiction. The transportation industry was adapting to political fragmentation by establishing alternative routing systems that avoided jurisdictional conflicts. Trucking companies began charging premiums for deliveries to disputed territories. Airlines suspended certain routes rather than navigate conflicting federal and state aviation regulations. Commerce was reorganizing around political boundaries. As January 21st progressed, it became clear that the subpoenas were just the beginning of a systematic campaign to eliminate state resistance to federal power. The constitutional republic that had governed America for over 2 centuries was being replaced by something that had no historical precedent and no clear endpoint. The silver market closed at $118 per ounce, reflecting not just supply and demand fundamentals, but the complete breakdown of confidence in American institutional stability. Investors weren't just hedging against economic uncertainty. They were hedging against the possibility that America as a constitutional system might not survive its own internal contradictions. The question was no longer whether federal and state authorities could find compromise. The question was whether any recognizable form of American government would emerge from the wreckage of constitutional breakdown. And increasingly, the answer seemed to be no.